Good evening. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Prime time with Vinny B. And we are going to talk about a gentleman that was one of the most self confessional writers in history. And pretty interesting dude. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for coming in, everybody. I hope you're having a great night. I hope your holiday season's going well. And hey, Mitch. So, John Lennon. Many people feel that John Lennon proverbially died before. Hey, DJ. December 1980. They feel when he took up with Yoko. Well, I would say, and I will make the case for it, that his creativity, if it didn't die, it was severely crippled. Now, why? What made John Lennon? What made him the writer that he was? For that, you'd have to break down what it is to be a songwriter. I'm a songwriter. I have probably 30 songs copywritten. I've played in a band. Nowhere on his level, obviously, or I wouldn't be on here tonight. I'd be in my mansion doing something. But look, John Lennon is one of the most revered songwriters in rock and roll history. And if you're 18 and you don't believe that and you think that Meghan Trainor is the best, God bless you. But when you get older and you maybe mature to the point where you can accept that bubblegum pop isn't necessarily good because it sells, then maybe not. But you could possibly agree with me. His compositions, both alone and a part of the legendary Lennon-McCartney team, they've cemented their place in the pantheon of modern songwriting giants. Okay? Whether it's Taupin and Elton John, you want to go back to Leonard Cohen, whomever. He was entrenched in a decade that totally redefined what it was to be a teenager, what it was to be a soldier, and what it was to be a human being. Now, to celebrate his 85th, which had just passed a couple of months ago, we'll go into some of the songwriting techniques that he used and explore how you can apply them to your own songwriting. I've tried to. And you can analyze some of the demos, comparing them to the finished releases. Right? Now, John Lennon versus Paul McCartney. John Lennon was a self-confessional writer from Mother, God, I Don't Want to Be a Soldier. Paul McCartney's talking about Penny Lane, Eleanor Rigby characters. John talking about himself a bit. Help. Little did they know he was screaming out for help. It wasn't just a catchy song to lead a movie. John Lennon's songs have a deeply cohesive quality. Now, sometimes they give you the impression that he wrote them in just this surge of inspiration in the middle of the night, got up, back then no recorder or a tape recorder, but started jotting down. But that isn't always the case. If you listen to the home recorded demos, which we have had a plethora through the anthology series and Get Back, Peter Jackson project, where you could see him working in the studio. Not as much as McCartney. We actually saw Paul McCartney invent Get Back right in front of us. But many of his songs were pieced together from fragments that he brainwashed at different times. Now, he said that he didn't pick up the guitar literally in 5 years when he became a house husband. And no one ever heard of what a house husband was until John Lennon even invented that. It was a stay-at-home dad until he made house husband the working title. Now, he did write fragments of songs. He didn't complete them, but he was always writing. Now, for example, Real Love, released originally as a part of the Beatles anthology, although we had heard it as Lennon fans way before then, right? I'm Stepping Out from the Milk and Honey album, which was released 4 years after his death. Those were songs he was working on that didn't make the Double Fantasy album, but they were worked on during that period. They were derived from 3 different compositions with shared elements. Snippets of Isolation from John's Plastic Ono Band, and an unreleased song called Let It Go, Let It Go. If you listen to all the outtakes and the stuff that he has bootleg that I have, it was present in earlier versions. John would move choruses, verses, bridges until he found the combination that worked for him. In fact, the song Jealous Guy, the music was Child of Nature, which he wrote in Rishikesh. And a couple of years later, repurposed it. And it became Jealous Guy. Because he didn't want to have another Nature song when Paul McCartney had Mother Nature's Son on the White Album. So John would move the choruses, the bridges, until he found that combination that spoke to him. Believe it or not, the chorus of Real Love was the verse to a primitive version of I'm Stepping Out. Modern songwriters can learn a lot from this. You can capture your random tidbits of inspiration, even though they don't fit in the song you're working on at that moment. But these little nuggets might be part of what you need for your next opus. Sometimes you need a little help from your friends. John had a piecemeal approach to his songwriting with Paul McCartney in those years. Instead of relying on himself to piece together the song fragments, he'd use Paul as a sounding board. Supposedly, he wrote In My Life when he was in Elmira, Spain, filming How I Won the War, and was stuck on the chorus, and Paul said, go in for a cup of tea and come back. And in a half hour, Paul had the chorus written out. Do I believe it? Don't know. I haven't spoke to either one of them. But probably somewhere, Paul seems to rewrite history. There's something about it. You know, where Paul rewrote it, John might have said, do you have a good phrase? You don't know. John would bring a sketch or a song fragment to Paul, or vice versa. Together, they would use an assembly line technique, which I call it, finishing, improving upon the original idea. 2 incomplete songs make a good one, A Day in a Life. I've Got a Feeling. Sometimes you could work independently of one another and write a beautiful song. Now, Paul's methodology was a little different. John always felt, sit down, complete it. Even if it doesn't come out good, don't come back to it. Be honest and make it rhyme. Now, whoever the creator of the song was back then would usually bring in the first verse, because I'm generally not going to bring in, here's the chorus. No, I usually started something. You know, I don't go into my car and already I'm on exit 10. I started the car, right? So Sometimes finding a collaborator is the best way for your creativity to overcome writer's block. And then the magic, which is in the air, like the dust particles the Sandman put in Paul's eyes when he woke up and yesterday was there. Many times, John composed the song from beginning to end, a single burst of creativity. He started writing Strawberry Fields that way in Almeria, Spain. He was on the beach in between takes and finished it up when he returned to England. But most of the song was written and then supposedly Paul McCartney helped with the middle eight. Very possible. It was inspired by his childhood memories. And you could dissect that lyric to death. And there are endless interpretations. But what does the song actually mean? Right? He may not have even been aware of what it meant when he was writing it, because sometimes things just go through you. Michael, yes. Send Kimberly my love, give her a hug for me, and I'm not getting crazy. But God bless her and God bless you, Michael. And thank you so much. That is so wonderful of you. You look at and Michael is a musician himself. And I'd love we have to talk, Mike. Just when you think you're about to write something, it means that you're ready to labor at it. You write lyrics and sometimes don't realize what they are going to mean until after. Sometimes there isn't a continuous flow. So what can we say? Embrace your inspiration. You could always make sense of it later. You don't have to understand now. Leave your opinions to yourself. Don't overthink, because you'd be surprised how wrong you usually are when you think people are talking about you. People have other things to do. So if you were to generalize, we could say that John's songs employ simple shouted out melodies, right? Philosophical lyrics that focus on isolation, pain, sex, politics, right? That's what John was. He has a lack of melodicism in his compositions. And I think that's because he wasn't technically a great musician. He played more on feel. He really couldn't sight read. By the end, he probably could. He could write a melody with the best of them when he wanted to. He was a craftsman. He said many times, if you give me something to write about, I won't like to do it that way, but I can do it. I've done it long enough where I can come out with something for you. He often addressed his audience in the first person, working class hero, expressing his feelings on the struggle between social classes. And he's written obliquely with I Am the Walrus, Magical Mystery Tour album. John likes fantastical characters. He may not relate to them, but he knows you do. And he's there to entertain you a bit. He's rebellious, acerbic. The acerbic wit is always going to take center stage. You ever have a friend who you know is just waiting there to pounce and say something at a dinner table? That was John. And the same rings true for every songwriter when you're composing. Your personality generally shines through. Billy Joel was very much like Paul McCartney. Not self-confessional. You don't know much about Billy, right? But you know about Brenda and Eddie, Zanzibar, Ali, and maybe Piano Man. He told you a little bit too much about himself, and then it took years for him to write again. And the thing also, or write in the first person. Also, Billy's problem was Billy always tried to be someone else. Billy, if you listen to the song Running on Ice, if I told you that was a Police song that Sting gave To Billy, you'd believe it. That sounds exactly like a song Sting would do with the Police, Running on Ice. Uptown Girl, Frankie Valli. Did the Ray Charles. Billy was great at being someone other than Billy. Now, you have to serve your song or to serve for what comes first, or yourself. What comes first? His Beatles stuff was much different than his solo stuff. Now, many of John's songs was probably overshadowed a bit by George Martin's larger-than-life arrangements. John would hum a song to George Martin, and Martin would write it out. John had no idea what the chords were or anything. Songs like Julia, he learned that picking style from Donovan. You Got to Hide Your Love Away. That demonstrates that his composition didn't need complex arrangements and over-the-top production to be successful. His comparative stripped-down versions of his solo work reinforces that. He was a competent guitarist. He was a pianist like he was a guitarist. He used to play with 3 fingers. His fingers, the middle would always be up. He was limited, but he could get by. John was a lazy guy. He was actually called by Maureen Cleave, someone who obviously the journalist for the Echo. Maureen Cleave was who he was talking about, Norwegian Wood, the affair. But he was far from a virtuoso. But that said, even his raw demos, accompanied by his own guitar and piano, they resonated with a quality that only a master can deliver. You knew that he may not be able to explain root notes and triplets and where they come from, the originators, but he could do it. Those who can't do teach. And those who can't teach do. So aspiring songwriters, if your song can't stand on its own, excessive production is not going to make it any better. In fact, it's going to make it stand out that it's not any good. Take my word for it. I've done it. Been there, done that, unfortunately. Now, he was a prolific writer. Look, with the Beatles, his solo career, he won 7 Grammys, picked up more nominations. And despite all his success, he was worried that his creativity was drying up. Now, I thought it changed with Yoko. See, the reason why John was never happy, John was always disappointed, because John was always looking for his mother. He always expected, when he went to the Maharishi, he expected that to be apparent. Brian Epstein, parent. He called Yoko mother. That doesn't seem too sexual in bed until you hear that he did have sexual fantasies about his mother when he was a teenager. So, you're dealing with someone that thinks a little differently than you and I. According to one of his closest friends, he had lingering paranoia that he would never write another good song. His friend Pete Shotton at school, and they remained close throughout his life. He bounced ideas off Shotton. So Shotton had an intimate view of Lennon's songwriting process. He didn't play a significant role in that process, but he heard about it. His back to the wall was when he was at his best. He felt inspiration by hitting the deadline. And he often dealt with writer's block while trying to stay on schedule. At Kenwood, where he lived, he generally wrote when the spirit moved him. Unless the Beatles were doing the studio to record a new album, of course. He would steal himself in for a week or two, virtually nonstop writing, and grab something out of it. On several occasions, the case of Nowhere Man, he couldn't come up with anything for hours. And he was a nowhere man. But bouts of writer's block with a 24 karat, I think he was probably bipolar or something, at the very least ADD. John Lennon had a very short attention span. And that could be very hard to continue writing when you get upset. Can't do it. Dry spells are only scary if you don't see water at the end of the tunnel. But then again, the light at the end of the tunnel doesn't always have to be an oncoming train. But his muse was gone, and that was Paul McCartney. He didn't have a daily writing practice either. He wrote songs when the inspiration struck him. And it didn't have to be anything significant. Commercials, children drawings. Good Morning was from the cereal commercial. I told you guys when he was being interviewed for the book in 66, I believe it was, the authorized biography of the Beatles. He was it Hunter Davies that was with him? He was in a pool and he heard sirens down, woo, 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 and that became, I am he is you are he is you. A TV advertisement, an old poster, a headline, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a drawing from a child in Julian's class. The words almost always preceded the music, and which in turn was generally composed on the piano rather than the guitar. I don't know if many people know that. Most of the time he wrote on the piano. He never formally played the piano, but he found it very helpful. And he did a good job at it. Now, after he'd complete the set of lyrics, he would prop it up on the piano in his little room and search for a suitable melody. Now, unlike McCartney, who learned how to play the piano properly, his father was hampered by arthritis. He used to have a lot of parties. His father was an amateur jazz musician. And his father always said if you could play the piano, you always get invited to parties. When Paul's father's arthritis was such where he couldn't really play anymore, Paul took over as a 14 or 15-year-old. John never bothered to learn to play the piano, which makes sense because John didn't have patience for anything. But he could peck out tunes with only one finger. And of course, McCartney held him to deadlines in the sessions in the 60s. Now, when the band broke up, he began using McCartney to push him to write. Not on good terms. Anytime McCartney wrote a good song, Lennon was driven to write one. But what happened to his process? What happened to his talent, the magical lyrics? John was lazy. And one producer said he'd hear something, oh shit, Paul's working. Coming Up was one of those songs that got John into the recording again. John kind of said, I better get working too. It's a nice story. We don't know if it's true, but they were always competitive. But I'll tell you, when I DJ'd for a while, Lucy O'Donnell, thanks, Mitch. DJ, that is a great version. I like the All You Need Is Love. All You Need Is Love, where he's scatting at the end. It's really cool. But you just look. Yeah, Maharishi became Sexy Sadie. George begged him not to do that. Reed. When I was writing songs in my band, the thing that I had to remember, once you forgive yourself, I think Michael would understand this. And I'm sure he's a great musician. I could just tell. Once you forgive yourself for not being the next Paul McCartney or John Lennon, you could be the next Vinnie Bracco. I realized, you know what? You could love every actor. You could think Clooney, Brando, Pacino, De Niro. They can't come here right now and be a better Vinnie Bracco than Vinnie Bracco can. They might be more attractive. They might enunciate better. They might get close. But they can't be a better me than me. And once you decide that, hey, I'm in this for me, I might as well be me because eventually the jig will be up and people will find out. So let them hate me at least, not someone that I'm pretending to be. So I think when there are conflicting reports, Yoko Ono lost all credibility with me when she had stated she didn't even know who the Beatles were. Eh. Next, she was hanging out with John Dunbar and with England and uh, all of these village people. There's no way they couldn't have heard of the Beatles. And supposedly, she went to Paul McCartney's house, asked for a manuscript. He wasn't into doing it. He sent her to John. I don't know if it was John Cage or she was doing a birthday party or something. And so Yoko certainly had a plan. I think that her plan, there was someone called Magic Alex. He was a Greek fellow who was a glorified television repairman. But John would get enamored with people. And he was going to build wallpaper speakers. And he fascinated John. And what happened was when they went to the Maharishi, he started feeling he was going to lose John. So what better than to get John away from the Maharishi, who John seemed to be putting all his eggs in that basket. John was very influenced. And I think Yoko saw that. Now, when you see the Get Back, the Peter Jackson version, Yoko's not really doing all that much. She's sitting there. Okay, that could be annoying when you've never had women sitting there before. You know, maybe the wives would come once in a while, a tech would come down to fix a mic or something like that. But other than that, or Brian Epstein would walk in, George Martin was there. The Beatles were the Beatles. The men went to work. It wasn't bring your wife to work day every day for 3 months. And I think that they didn't know how to handle it. Supposedly, Paul was pretty nice to her. But Paul felt jokingly, he said, like, I feel like I have to write a song about a white wall when I'm standing talking to him because I'm talking to her when I'm talking to him. Yes, you were addressing Yoko. When they went to George's house the first time after George left the band, it didn't go well at all, but that was an Apple meeting. People think they just went to meet him for that. It wasn't. They had to sign papers. And George was talking to John, and Yoko's answering. John was there quiet. That's what they didn't like. They felt they lost their buddies, and they did. So, also, you never heard of John Lennon. None of that band ever really heroin. Um, all of a sudden, she's around, and he gets into heroin, and he states it's because they treated her so poorly that we were in so much pain, and she lost a baby, which is terrible. And the press was terrible to her. She was a foreigner. She was Japanese, and the way he left his wife, that was in the paper. It was terrible. He wasn't even divorced. She knew how to handle John. And unfortunately, she was handling him for her benefit. She wanted to be a star. And what better way than to have the millionaire Beatle on your own? I think his creativity was stifled because she had a lot to say. There's nothing wrong with your partner having a lot to say. Nothing. There is something wrong when they're saying it for solely their own benefit and not even putting your needs. There is no reason why John couldn't have done side projects and done a Beatle album every year or 6 months. No reason. Someone had asked me, they tried to stump me with a Beatle question, why Paul McCartney had the beard during Let It Be. Well, first of all, when George said your beard suits you, man, means he hasn't seen him with one. After the Hey Jude, David Frost episode, Paul went to Long Island to visit Linda's parents. First time he ever met them, other than John and Lee Eastman flying over. I think he had met them once on a 5-week holiday. He grew the beard and sunglasses and wore a floppy hat and went to Broadway and wanted to walk around and see New York. That was a disguise, the beard. And when he got on January 1st or 2nd to Twickenham Studios, he still had the beard. And as soon as Let It Be was over, he shaved it for Abbey Road. And then he grew it back again because the winter was coming and he was in Scotland. But yeah, he grew that beard as a disguise when he was in New York meeting her family. But Yoko, you could tell when he came to New York, he didn't see his family for years from England. He didn't see his son for years. He saw his son at Disneyland in 73. And then in 76, when he signed the papers for the dissolution, they did it in the hotel in Manhattan. Lennon didn't go. Lennon signed it at Disney World in Florida. That's where he signed his. And she had her fingerprints all over him. Listen, when you call someone mother, that's why what I was going to say, the Maharishi disappointed him. He was always looking for a parental figure. And supposedly the Maharishi was serving chicken to a nurse that had gone there, and she came white-faced to Paul and John, telling them that there was no chicken there. He served me chicken, the lights were on, he put his hairy arms around me. And Mia Farrow had a similar story. And John and George and Paul were peeking through the window to see if anything went on, which they didn't catch him. Story was that they talked all night about it. And when George had doubts, then John said, must be George is going against them. And they went and said, we're leaving. And in that little voice, why are you leaving? And John said, if you're so effing mystical, you'll know. And the Maharishi reached out to everyone in town not to help them. I think Mal Evans and someone rented 2 old cars, but no one was helping them with the luggage, nothing. I think it was a 6-hour ride to the ashram, and they finally got home. And the Maharishi and, the foot of the Ganges, the foothills, certainly Paul wrote about Rocky Raccoon. The continuing story of Bungalow Bill was a true story. About a guy that used to go out and hunt. Sexy Sadie was Maharishi, what have you done? Mike Love was there, undoubtedly. That's why Birthday, back in the USSR, came about. Donovan, Dear Prudence, and Julia, The Picking Style. So a lot of music came out of there. And in fact, George was very annoyed George said, enough with the music. We came here to meditate. And they were walking around with guitars, John and Paul. My question was, why did they bring them? If they were going there to meditate and George didn't want, why did they bring the guitars? So George must have known. Yeah. Yeah, I don't believe that. That she had to. Now, are there songs that John Lennon wrote without the Beatles that would have stood the test of time with the Beatles? Yeah, I think Walls and Bridges had a couple of good songs. Going Down on Love, it might have made it. Number 9, Dream, commercially, probably would have fit more in 1967. Um, and then, yeah, about Prudence Farrow. That's who that was written about. Prudence Farrow didn't come out of her room for a couple of days. And they're worried about her. And John wrote Dear Prudence for her. And Jennifer Juniper, who was Pattie Boyd's sister, that's how Donovan wrote that song. But Yoko certainly had a mesmerizing effect on John Lennon. John Lennon, they were having a tough time with drugs. In fact, a couple of people had said that Paul McCartney was horrid in 1968. I believe Neil Aspinall was one of them that said, I couldn't stand Paul in 1968. He was with Francie Schwartz. After he met Linda, Linda went back to the East. He met Francie Schwartz, who came into Apple all gruffy and grimy and all that. She wanted to meet Paul McCartney. They set it up. She came in with her hair done and a dress and looked totally different. And that night, she slept over his house. In fact, during the song Blackbird, Francie Schwartz is the girl sitting there during the anthology period when you see her. Pretty girl. I think she was 21 years of age. But Paul was doing a lot of cocaine in 1967. They all were. And again, in 75, Venus and Mars album, Paul was tooting it up quite a bit. In fact, George Harrison in the mid-70s had a cocaine problem himself. His wife went on to say that, George was conveniently spiritual. George was one of the only guys that I've ever seen that after he learned how to meditate, he became more ornery. Think about it. George was a lot nicer before he learned to meditate. But yeah, George would go on binges. Olivia knew the girl in town that he'd come home 2-3 days later after a cocaine binge. If you look at during the Dark Horse, look at his pictures during the Dark Horse period. Well, he had meningitis. He was in the hospital, I think, for about a month or a month and a half, I believe, with meningitis. He got very sick. But he looked terrible. He looked frail, gaunt. And Ringo was drinking. And I'm sure, that was the period where they were doing all the drugs. But Paul McCartney wasn't the nice guy in 1968. And they went to clean up. And that was the first time, I believe, in 6 or 7 years that John, they started with, speed, the pills, which were pretty much diet pills in Hamburg. They were working 6 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think they worked 91 straight days, 6 hours a day, manned 600 working hours. And they needed something to keep themselves awake. You see how thin they got. And then you see in 64, 65, how heavy John got. But they went to clean up. They were all searching for something. John knew his marriage was ending. Cynthia originally thought the trip would be great. And then after a week or so, or 2 weeks, he wanted to bunk on his own. He moved out of her quarters and then hardly spoke to her. And he was getting up 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, running to the post office. And Yoko was pretty much every day sending him a letter. And he couldn't wait. He wrote the song, I'm So Tired. He was tired. And about Yoko. Yeah, they had an affair, Harrison and Stevie Nicks. I was told from someone in the music business he also had an affair with Madonna. Someone who knew Madonna very well. I remember, I think it was July 10th, 1985, I saw Madonna at the Garden. And someone I knew in the music business who knew my manager, the band's manager, said that they knew for a fact that they were. But the Beatles were a mess in 68. Lennon finally had cleaned up with drugs, being at the ashram for 3.5, 4 months. Paul only stayed 5 weeks, I think, or 6 weeks. Ringo was there about a week, 2 weeks, I think. He came with a suitcase of baked beans and eggs because, he was in the hospital for like 2 out of the first 3 years of his life when he was a small kid and couldn't eat. And they missed the kids. They had kids at that time. I think they had 2 boys who were probably, 5 and 4 or something like that. And, but they thought it would be a healing process for them. John totally changed when they came back from there. John wasn't the same person. If you do the reading, and I've read many books on the Beatles, he wasn't the same person. He probably knew he didn't want his marriage at that point. On the plane back, he admitted to Cynthia all the affairs he'd had, and Maureen Cleave was one of them, and said Eleanor Braun from Help. Girls at hotels, he destroyed her. And she still thought that she could make it right. She loved him. And, but he was searching for something and right away went back on drugs because when he went back to England, who was there? Yoko. And his whole creative process was short-circuited. Like PTSD, and I do believe that something terrible can happen in your life and you look like you've recovered, but you haven't. And I do believe that was very prevalent in his life. I believe that one of the reasons, a small one, that they didn't get back together was he was afraid. I think he was afraid that they would fail. Music had changed. He saw young bucks like Led Zeppelin was tremendous in the 70s. They took over ELO, right? You had Elton John was the biggest thing in music in the 70s. And then Billy took over for him in the 80s. And the only reason I think that Bernie Taupin left Elton at the end of 79, I think, but people were just sick of hearing Elton John. You love your mother-in-law too, but you don't want to see her every second. I think a lot of it was just fatigue, singles fatigue, that for 3-4 years, Elton John was all over the place and enough. But I think John was afraid. Look at 1983, Islands in the Stream, crossover from country was the number one on the Billboard pop chart. Music had changed. I think the true reason the Beatles were the ones who set the trends. The Beatles did something and everybody followed. Now, the Beatles were following. Think about it. The Beatles weren't the trendsetters anymore. Elton John took over that mantle. Do you really think the Beatles are going to wrestle it back that quickly from him? Probably not. And being out of the music business, look at Muhammad Ali, was out of boxing 2 or 3 years, was not the same box. He was great, not the same. Baseball player Ryne Sandberg retired for a couple of years, came back. He wasn't old, not the same player. When you get out of the game does pass you by a little. Game speed is different than going in the recording studio playing. Anybody will tell you. You could practice all you want, the NHL. When you get to the game speed is just a totally different. And I think that John was afraid of that. I think John wondered if he had it anymore. And you have to remember, the first couple of years, he didn't. The only time he went to number one was when Elton helped him. Think about it. John Lennon probably would have never had a number one song. And I do believe when John said he was thinking about writing with Paul, there is no way anyone can convince me that that rumor started right after he went number one with Elton John. There was no way John was going to start writing with Paul again when Paul's coming off Band on the Run and John hasn't had a number one. No way. Because he had a big ego, John. He would think that Paul was carrying him. He would think that people think that he needs Paul because Paul is number one. John's not. I think that would have drove him crazy. After he had a number one, all of a sudden John was, maybe we'll write again. You didn't hear it before then. Because he did not want to be perceived as the one that needed Paul McCartney. Because that looks like Paul was the brains and the genius. Coming off his own number one, he could say, hey, I'm number one too. I truly believe that was a lot of it. Do I think the Beatles would have been as successful if they went back together in 1974? Absolutely not. I think they would have been very successful, but they would not have held the 70s like they held the 60s. They wouldn't have. The game had changed. Music had changed. Technical advances. Guys 10 years their junior, who teenagers, Elton was 25 at the time when John was 30, or 26, whatever he was. In 1974, John's 34, Elton's about 26. Big difference. Big difference. They missed that generation. It was much like I always felt. I did a paper in graduate school about the police, and the ethnicity changed with police when police officers in 1970, a generation was skipped. Their sons, who were flower people, who went against establishment, weren't going to become police officers. They lost a whole generation. And I believe that, look, the Beatles, when they went hippie-ish in 68, the girls from 1964 were now 20, 21. They're getting engaged. They're working. A little different. And that's why the Monkees became big. But the Monkees were actors. Different ballgame. But I think that in the 70s, it would have been rough. I don't think the Beatles could have redefined the 70s. I'll tell you why. You had Led Zeppelin, who was the newer, and improved Who. And because the Who came out of the 60s and were buried by the Beatles and Stones, Zeppelin didn't have the Beatles to contend with anymore, really, nor the Stones. And Zeppelin became a powerhouse. Elton John, Led Zeppelin, as big as they were, couldn't stop rock, yacht music, and couldn't stop disco. Think about it. That 70s decade was so unsure of itself, it didn't even know what music it wanted. Think about it. You had yacht rock, you had disco, and then you had punk. So it couldn't even define what it wanted to be, the 70s. I think that, in and of itself, would have caused a problem. I think the Beatles had some real heavy competition now. When you're the trendsetter, people defer to you. They weren't the biggest game in town anymore. I know when I worked in England in 1991 and 92. Yes, Mitch, thanks. I was talking to someone and they told me by 1975, 76, honestly, no one in England gave a shit about the Beatles. True story. And I thought it was odd. And then I started dating a girl in the 80s. And in the 70s, she was a kid, 2 years my junior. So in 1975, she's 13 or 12. And I asked her, and she goes, not so much. The Bay City Rollers in 76, but not so much. America still had this hot nut for the Beatles. America was pushing the when are they getting back together, when are they getting back together, not England, because John wasn't in England anymore. Ringo had moved to LA. The Beatles weren't even living there anymore, the two main. And that's the way it was. So I think they would have been successful, but they weren't going to be the trendsetters anymore. And John had a tremendous ego, and I think it would have destroyed him. Look, in the 70s, you had Bowie, Elton, lesser degree Billy Joel, who wasn't really popular in 77. He didn't take off with that big song. You had Springsteen, who wasn't really popular till 80 with Hungry Heart. But you had ELO, who pretty much took over for the Beatles. And Tears for Fears took over for ELO. Tears for Fears, the orchestration, all that. But your songwriting changes when you get older. You're not going to, I'll give you a perfect example. I was talking to Brian Setzer. I remember Brian Setzer told me, I stopped doing Sexy in 17 because my daughter was 16. And I just couldn't go up there and do it anymore. He told me that a long time ago, 20 years ago. And it was interesting. You're not going to write about I saw her standing there or she loves you when you're 36. And we know John Lennon didn't like to write when given a script. So what was he going to write about? Even the song Number 9 Dream, his favorite number, Going Down on Love. He was feeling lousy. Yoko wasn't with him. You can go through that album. and I thought it was a good album compared to what he had done. His first album with Imagine was brilliant, but he had changed. I think the confidence. I think John really needed Paul there, but Paul definitely needed John as well. But the album was really well produced. I thought. I think it was a little over the top produced. Honestly, it was a little over the top, but I thought it was a good album. It certainly was. I think better than they expected. I think that the album did pretty well. But if you look at that's his first real good album after the Plastic Ono Band. Okay, Going Down on Love. Okay, he was depressed. That's what he felt. Whatever gets you through the night. He wrote that after hearing Reverend Ike. And Reverend Ike said, whatever gets you through the night. And John just wrote the whole song while he was watching the show. Bless You, Scared. Write a song called Scared. Number 9, Dream, Surprise, Surprise, Sweet Bird of Paradox. That was for May Pang, supposedly. Steel and Glass. He was walking around and all the buildings were steel and glass in LA. LA's buildings were different in the 70s than New York's buildings. They were all glass. Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out. Wasn't as successful. And then I think John realized he was writing about himself. But and then when he comes back, no one really cared about what he felt about Yoko. Half the people didn't want him with Yoko. You really care? I'm stepping out of the house, and they didn't care. I don't think they cared anymore that they thought she broke the Beatles up because everyone had their own lives. But his songwriting took a big hit. And sometimes you could try too hard too. I think that was part of it too. Just trying too hard to be successful, putting that pressure on yourself, and being afraid that music had changed and not knowing which way to go. Seeing Paul with Wings very successful and John not thinking he could be that successful. And it would really show, God forbid, John comes out with an album and Paul releases an album and it goes to number 1 and John's is toiling in number 20. It's the message. People would, oh, you see, Paul's the best. They won't remember what happened later on. Sean Lennon? Yeah. I think it's terrible that Julian Lennon was never bigger. Julian Lennon is very talented. Julian is equated, believe it or not, more with his father than Sean, even though John was more of a father to Sean. But when you look at Julian Lennon, although Sean probably looks a little more like John, you think of Julian Lennon as John Lennon's son. I do, at least. I'm sure Sean's fine as a musician. I don't really listen to him. But Julian Lennon is outstanding. But I think people felt, how dare you try to be your father? Very hard to live up to a great man. You get knocked for trying. And I think that's what happened with Julian. But Julian is Saltwater, some brilliant songs. Brilliant. Just was never able to just. Yeah, Julian's songwriting read is also confessional. A lot of minor chords. Very good lyricist, but Vlad is great. And he was what, about 21 or 22 when he did Vlad? Volat was excellent, and that really sounded like John. And then when I think he tried to get away from sounding like his father, he took a hit. And he truly does sound like his father. The mannerisms. I think Sean is more like his mother. But, you know, both pretty good genes. And let me tell you something. Yoko is not void of talent. Yoko's an outstanding pianist. Yoko has some, she can't sing, but Yoko has some talent. One of those songs was a very big hit in Europe, that dance song that she did. And if you want to say that she was a decade ahead, the B-52s started doing stuff that Yoko was doing 10, 12 years before, maybe. Yes, the media was very hard on Julian. They were brutal to Julian. Julian did the talk show stuff in England. He was on Jules Holland's show, which is one of the biggest there, and all that as a podcast. When he wanted to go on as a guest, the producer said no. He didn't understand why. It went so well. For whatever reason, they thought it was sacrilege. And it wasn't fair. I'll tell you something. It would have really been interesting if Julian got together with Danny Harrison. I think that would have been interesting. Danny's a pretty good musician. I think Julian and Paul 25 years ago, not Paul at 84 years old, 83 years old, would have been interesting. Really would have been. But I think Paul would have thought that people would have thought it was a cash grab. And they would have thought that he was using Lennon. Um, Interesting. Paul McCartney's stepsister, the Paul's father's new wife's daughter. Yeah, they get along. They were in a hotel and he was Julian Lennon was doing a tour, and all the paparazzi, Lennon and McCartney, and they took a picture together and everything. I think in the 90s. Yeah, Julian gets along with Sean. I just don't think that Yoko's any good. I never had any use for Yoko. Too many people. One of the nicest people that I've ever read about, and by all accounts, is Cynthia Lennon. Cynthia Lennon does not talk negatively about anyone, nor does Julian Lennon. And they both slam Yoko Ono. I cannot see because, and I'll tell you why, because May Pang became friends with Cynthia Lennon. Excellent album, Jude. Excellent. He came out of, he accepted, he changed his name legitimately too. His name was John originally. They used to call him Julian. He changed his name to Julian and he accepted Jude for who he was. And he thought that would be a great point to start questioning him about his life on the circuit. And no one took him up. Was that Ruth? And and Ruth said a lot of unflattering things about Paul. Paul was an egotist. Paul made his father feel like shit sometimes. He's probably stoned out of his head, but Paul was an odd guy. I think it was probably drugs because Paul appears to be a nice guy. He appears to be a workaholic, but there are very strange rules also when you're in his band. vegetarian, being a vegetarian, and all this stuff. There's no meat around. You have to be okay with that. I wonder, I bet you never thought of this, Reed. I wonder if he minds the calf skin drums. On the Let It Be album, the Abbey Road album was the first time Ringo used calfskin drums. Yeah, Paul. Yeah, Paul is well. Paul holds all his feelings close to the vest. Paul does not talk. Ringo doesn't either. I'll tell you the person from Beatlemania, meaning the '60s, who impresses me more than anyone is Jane Asher. Jane Asher could have written a book, never did. Won't go on the interview circuit. Do you know how much money she would get? She was a classy woman, Jane Asher. The problem was, Paul met her at 21. But very classy woman and actually a good actress. But yeah, Denny Lane, yeah, Paul is odd. Paul keeps his feelings to himself. Oh, she's a class. Yeah, absolutely, Reed. She's a class act, Jane Asher. When I spoke to her brother, Peter, I wanted to ask him, I wanted to interview him. And the first thing I was going to ask him, he would have left. I was going to say, was it hard for you when you know that your brother-in-law is cheating every 5 minutes with someone and he's engaged to your sister? I wanted to ask that. How are you loyal to your sister if you see this guy screwing everything that moves? Right? Interesting. So did John Lennon lose his talent for songwriting? Oh, he produced for a lot of people, yeah. Uh, I think John Lennon had his window. I think he had a great 7 to 10 year window, and you're in your prime until you're not, and that's what I think. Paul McCartney as well. I don't think after the Tug of War album, Paul ever did anything earth shattering. I thought Memory Almost Full was a pretty nice conceptual idea. And it was very nicely produced because Paul is good at that. But, arguably, Paul hasn't come out with a good song in 35, 40 years. Think about it. There are only a couple of songs. I'll tell you a couple of songs that are worthy, that I believe. In the last, say, 35 years. Let's see. See if you agree with me, Reed. You were a DJ. I'll give you songs that I think were okay. Let's see. There are a couple. Let me go to some late stuff. The song I Don't Know, pretty good song. I think The Fireman, that, there was some good stuff off that. The Fireman had some good stuff, but, I think I Don't Know, um, I thought London Town was good. It's a little schmaltzy, but I thought that was okay. Uh, Arrow Through Me was in the last 46 years, top 3 songs that he's done. Your Loving Flame was okay. Winter Bird, When Winter Comes, pretty good. The problem with that was they used vocals from 30 years ago at the end. If you notice his vocals are different, it's because he started that song a long time ago. But Waterfalls, excellent. North McCartney too. I thought that Tug of War was pretty good, but really far and few between. Yeah, the Fireman series is excellent. Yes, he was very good with Elvis Costello. That's another guy. Elvis is probably 10 years his junior, 11 years. Had more of a pulse on what was going on. Paul needs someone to go head to head with. Yeah, Flowers in the Dirt was excellent. You Love Her Too, good album. Yeah, I think Memory Almost Full, When I Die, that last song on there, excellent. That song that's like, Eleanor Rigby, what is that song? It's a political song. It was actually about Trump. I forget what song it was. Um, don't remember, but that was okay. Yes, Mitch. Just look, you're talking about icons, but the Fireman series is interesting. Ballroom Dancing is good. Yeah, very good. That could have been a couple of those songs could have been a Beatle album in the early '80s, and then Pipes of Peace would have throwaways that didn't make the Tug of War album. Same sessions. Pipes of Peace and Tug of War is kind of like Rubber Soul and Revolver. You really can't separate those albums much. The Tug of War stuff was better. But look at The Average Person, that song. Paul is anything but average. Paul always writing a little novelette in 3 minutes. That's what Paul likes to do. My Brave Face is okay. I'll tell you what's a good song. No More Lonely Nights is a good song. Yeah, Pipes of Peace and Broad Street. No, well, Broad Street, there was no reason to re-record those. He had nothing else to do. But it was interesting hearing them with newer technology. Interestingly enough, because the songs that he put to all the strings and everything on Broad Street, that's what he argued about with Phil Spector. All he did was complain that he didn't want Let It Be with the orchestration. Meanwhile, he took 2 songs off that album and orchestrated them. Think about it, right? The Long and Winding Road. He was miserable that Phil Spector orchestrated that up. So what did he do? Twice as much orchestration, right? I bet you never thought of that, Reed. That's why I'm here, baby. So, yeah, he lost his talent for writing hits, not for songwriting. And if he would have been inspired, look, the best album that he did in the 70s was when he was not with Yoko. What was he doing? Hanging around with his friends. What was he doing? Despite repeated warnings. That's it. That's about Donald Trump, that song. When he was hanging out with his friends, he had that creativity. You're bouncing off Harry Nilsson. You have Keith Moon in the room. You have your former bandmate Ringo there. You even saw Paul. Right? You have Alice Cooper hanging with you, part of the Hollywood Vampires. Some guys that were a little younger, that was still absolutely Reed. Oh, well, he contradicted him. I bet you, other than you and I, no one thought about that. All he did was slam Phil Spector for ruining The Long and Winding Road. You couldn't orchestrate that song off Give My Regards any more than he did that. Right? And I think it sounds good, but it sounds like a musical. You know, what annoyed him more than anything was after Sergeant Pepper and the White Album, Paul and John said, we'll go back to basics, no overdubbing. That's why during the song Let It Be, John Lennon's on the bass, and he misses like 10 notes. They didn't want overdubbing. So what happened? That became more overdubbed, that album, Let It Be, than any other album. John was the one who said, I don't want any dubbing. And then he brings Phil Spector in, and he said, John, it was your idea not to overdub anything. But they were just doing things to annoy each other. Really? Wow. That's his biggest hit, My Love Can Tire. His biggest hit. Can you imagine? Global appeal. I think Yesterday's overrated. I think it's good, but I think it's overrated. I could think of 3 songs that are just as good as Yesterday. I think the song Suddenly by Billy Ocean is brilliant. After the Love Is Gone by Chicago, by Earth, Wind and Fire. If You Need Me, If You Leave Me Now, Chicago. Those songs are as good as Yesterday. The Beatles were a hot ticket in 1965. Everyone, thank you so much. Now, within the half hour, I'll have my shorts up for tomorrow, which is today, December 5th. Thank you so much for coming in. Mike, I hope you have a great night. I don't think you're still on, but God bless you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you. So, Crippled Inside was good. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was very nice of you. And Kimberly, God bless you, dear. And I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Take care.